Scare King of D&D Homebrew, talking today about how to make a dungeon crawl palatable to your players. And when I say palatable, I mean, and we think of these quote unquote modern players who, even if you're running, let's say, an OSR style system, aren't necessarily going to end what people think of with a dungeon crawl, which is an endless slog through a dungeon, constantly worried about supplies, equipment. It becomes an endurance test, and survivability is really a problem. As opposed to the thing I think a lot of, and again, I'm going to say modern or newer or whatever that's out there, the things they're interested in, which is narrative elements, their character's storyline, interacting with an environment in which the constrained environment of a dungeon, the artificiality of it, doesn't lend itself to that. It becomes one room after another and just fighting monsters, right? That's the image we have of the dungeon crawl. And to be truthful, that's the way it was. On my Patreon, I took an old map, one of the very first ones I ever drew at 14, and converted it into a dungeon draft file to be used in a VTT or whatever for my patrons. And I went into this and thought to myself, wow, this was weird, right? Just endless, again, I was 14 years old, but endless rooms and rooms, which were all stocked with monsters. And we just went around and killed them and got treasure, and we got experience from treasure. And people want a different thing, I think, first of all, not just the different mechanics and the rules light system, because those rules were kind of rules light compared to a 5e or Pathfinder experience. But also in terms of just, what's the narrative thrust here of this story? It's an artificial environment that sort of doesn't make sense, as opposed to having, going out into the wilderness, which is what we did too, very quickly, to interact with cities and, different factions and, have much more of a social type game than just hack and slash. Now, again, in mine, it really wasn't all hack and slash, but that's another story. So here's what I think you can do if you really want to have a mega type dungeon where the players are going to spend quite a bit of time in it, how to make that interesting. And the first step is to tie your narrative threads to the dungeon. Whatever is going on above ground, have something important related to that story that is in this underground place that the players are searching for, that they've heard about. And it isn't necessarily going to be, 12 levels of dungeons before you find this item. And again, it doesn't have to be tied to an item. It's just there's something about this place that ties into a larger storyline that's going on. So you have some keep. I had the Keep of Niz, which was this place that had been devastated on the surface. And for centuries, you couldn't get into these entrances. There were protections, and suddenly someone discovered a secret entrance. But it wasn't just, let's go explore. There was something rumored to be there that was going to solve the mystery of this ancient civilization. And then there was a race to get this. So the players were competing with one another, which is a narrative hook. We've got to go there. We've got to find this. And we can accept a certain slog element to it because it's connected to the story. And another thing is to diversify the sort of encounters and challenges the players meet. I've done many different, I did a video on making unique geometry. I've done videos on puzzles. I've done videos on traps. These are all things the players can encounter that aren't just monsters in a room waiting to attack. Roll initiative. Especially, like puzzles and traps, if they're done well, a lot of players, you think, it's hokey or it's like kids. I've heard people say this, and yet, first of all, there's a rich tradition in mythology and stuff, riddles, the Sphinx and whatnot. There's also puzzles. You can have a culture which is into using puzzles to protect things. Only those in the know the answer to these things, and that instead of having just locks that can be picked or broken, there's a magic puzzle that has to be solved, just like a password on your online accounts. That's a form of a puzzle. And if you're going to make access to that to other people, it has to be something that people can solve if they're in the know. So you diversify the challenges and the encounters, and it isn't that sloggy element. And the other thing is to use the environment of a dungeon to tell your story. So on the walls, there can be drawings. The floors have mosaics that tell things about what the players are looking for. I always have tapestries and whatnot. And I have furniture that are part of the story. that have to be explored and have to be interpreted by the players based on knowledge that they've either gotten as they've explored the dungeon or up above. But you're not just going from room to room to room, the old school listening, is there anything in there you burst through, whatever. Now, and again, we did all this stuff, which is interesting, but it does make, because I've done this with modern players, and they're interested. They want to solve puzzles. They want to try to figure out what's going on in some place, and how did this get to be here? Like the old Keep of Niz thing. Because it was 2 levels, one dungeon this guy had built, and then underneath was an ancient dungeon that he built his keep over, as the players found out, for a very good reason, that he wanted to keep an eye on it. And now we're going to talk about mapping, because you want to make the mapping process of a dungeon where you're doing a dungeon crawl palatable. Because what we used to do is, I as the GM would call out the next corridor, and you'd have a mapper that would be drawing it. And we'd sit there and do that for an entire 12 levels of dungeons or whatever. I don't know if people are going to, maybe you can find someone to do that, but you're constantly having to correct things and whatever. And then if you want unique geometry, they were those were very square dungeons in those days when I'm just looking at a piece of paper and calling it out. And now with all this mapping software, you can make all these crazy shapes. Well, that's not going to work. Now, if you're in a VTT environment, that's easier to do because the map is there, and then you have line of sight things, and as the players explore it. But you can get around this in a mega dungeon with an in-person group. One of the things that you can do is theater the mind until you get to a certain place where you feel the need. If you're using miniatures or whatever, you're not doing theater the mind. You do it up to there, and maybe some of the encounters. But then you either make a battle map, you draw that out, or have it pre-drawn. When you're constantly drawing those out, players can get annoyed. I've seen it. Or you go and buy some of those prepaid, battle maps that you get a book of them, and just adapt those to the situation at hand. Make your dungeon around the mats that you've purchased so that you can just pull it out and it totally matches the story, whatever's on that dungeon map that you've purchased, and you just off you go. And that makes it easier. The other way to reduce the mapping thing is the players have discovered a map to the dungeon. And whether it's one level of the dungeon, whether it's the entire dungeon, whatever that is, but once they get there, they know where they're going. And again, then you'll have the battle map thing situation ready if you're going to do, using miniatures in some situation, not constantly. Because again, if you're gonna have room after room after room, and we got to have that all drawn out, or here's another map, and these battles are not that interesting, pick your spots where you're actually going to have those miniatures. So you're using theater of the mind quite a bit. You're handing out maps that they can see. And you're not necessarily going to have the teleport chambers where, unbeknownst to you, you've gone down a level or everything is backwards. We used to do that. And it was a pain because you had someone carefully drawing out this dungeon, and all of a sudden they realize, this is totally wrong. This is all screwed up. So, I would say that was all fun and great. And if you want to try it, go for it. But I would say in the modern parlance, you're trying to get that, that dungeon crawl going. Avoid that kind of thing. And another thing in a dungeon crawl is to get roleplay to be very useful, even critical, to the players navigating their way through. They meet another party who they have to talk with. They meet a person that's lost. They need a person, whether that's some sentient creature, whether humanoid or not, that needs help, that has information. So that there's a role play with a dynamic sort of either group or individual, where it isn't just like looking at clues and puzzles and killing things and seeing what's in their, in their pockets or whatever to find information. It's actually interacting with other people that are either living here or exploring it. Think of those ways where you can recreate what you're doing all the time above ground and put it down in the dungeon. And as always, reward player agency when they think of some way to solve a puzzle or a situation or resolve something with role play, with a clever tactic, something aside from just roll initiative and fight these things. Reward people for that. Let them know that you can avoid battles or get around things or solve. You get some map and you get a shortcut and you realize I can go through here and go up this level or something like that, where they realize this is not just a slog. You're exploring this dungeon because what you're also doing is abstracting the notion of keeping track of equipment and bulk and all the stuff we used to do, but saying instead the difficulty of this, you're going to want to figure out a way to get around certain areas and get through places and not fight things and whatever, so that you're not wasting all sorts of time going through rooms that are not necessarily meaningful to whatever your objectives are. And that relates to what I was talking about earlier about a narrative, through line to this dungeon, which related to things up above, and it has something they want. Because what this will also do is the thing, when we say slog, when we say endless corridors, we say slow pacing. When we say having to keep track of supplies, I've got to sleep a week in the day, I got to go up, get stuff, come back down. That pacing and that urgency, that's what people, fear with some endless dungeons. Again and again, we're here again, we're still here, right? We're not above ground. So when you have this narrative thrust and when you give them opportunities to use other things than just fighting things to make their way through and get shortcuts and figure things out and realize, we don't have to do this. Because the other element is that's why other people have had a slog in this dungeon that they've heard about. Because they're not as clever as the players. They're not using the modern techniques of gaming. They're just going in and attacking. The players are going to get around that. And that pacing is so critical. You got to have, if you're going to have battles, make them short and sweet. You could have hand wave stuff. They run away, this, that. Because you'll find yourself in a room. Because again, the tactics of a room, if you like battles, can be very interesting with pillars and, rubble and, different terrain types and different levels. I mean, there's so many great things you can do in a dungeon in a constrained area from a tactical sense. But you don't want to just keep doing it and doing it and doing it. So you're drawing out this mega dungeon. This is going to be great. And I got 400 rooms per level and 10 levels. That better be pretty empty. Because if it's full of monsters or I got to figure my way through it, you're talking so many sessions that, unless that's your campaign, I suppose, right? But I think in the modern things too, I don't want to spend all my time underground. So I'm going to do a dungeon crawl. I'm going to say you got to start from A and get to point B, and there's potentially a lot of things there, but I'm going to be thinking about the pacing all of the time. So hopefully that is helpful. I would really like to hear from you. Are you running dungeon crawls? Maybe you have a whole campaign that's based on dungeons. I don't know. And of course, a shout out to my Patreon supporters. As I said, I made this kind of crazy dungeon level based on one that I had drawn and talked about whether that concept is outdated or not. And if you like what you've seen, give me a like, give me a comment on what you think about dungeon crawls in general. Most importantly, keep playing an RPG game, whichever one you choose, and tell somebody else about it.